You're listening to the RN Mentor, a podcast designed to document and bring you the work and experience of some of the most influential nurses in our profession. We will be sitting down and having a discussion with the leaders of today's nursing world as they share their work, how they navigate their nursing path, and their views on the future of the profession. My name is Ali Tayeb. I am a registered nurse, United States Navy veteran, a Jonas Veterans Healthcare Scholar, and your host for the RN Mentor. Hello and welcome to another episode of the RN Mentor podcast. Today I am being joined by a colleague that I've admired from afar, I should say, through social media. But I'm so glad I have her here, Dr. Jess Dillard-Wright. She is a nurse and midwife, serves as director for the College of Nursing Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and as teaching faculty in the pre-licensure clinical nurse leader MSN program at Augusta University. Dr. Dillard-Wright received her Bachelor's of Science, Technology, and Culture at Georgia Institute of Technology, her Master's of Science in Women's History from Sarah Lawrence College, her Master's of Nursing Science, Clinical Nurse Leader from Medical College of Georgia, and her Master of Science in Community-Based Nurse Midwifery from Frontier Nursing University. She is a Jonas Nurse Leader Scholar alumna and an NEF Scholar. Her doctoral studies combine her love for feminist thought, philosophy of science, and history with her passion for nursing. Dr. Dillard-Wright's dissertation study is titled Cassandra, Radical Feminist Nurse Network, Feminism, Nursing, and a History of the Present, a little-known but powerful collective of activist nurses that resist heteropatriarchal norms in nursing, creating a space for women's identified community. Her scholarship has been published in nursing philosophy and advanced in nursing science. Dr. Dillard-Wright is one of the organizers of Radical Nurse Collective, a founding member of the Nursology Theory Collective, and an organizer with the startup Nursing Mutual Aid. And there's a lot more to this. You can catch Dr. Dillard-Wright's full bio on my website, www.alirtayeb.com. So www.alirtayeb.com. Welcome to the show, Dr. Dillard-Wright.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
I am super excited to have you. Like I said, we have been connected through social media for quite some time, and we've on one occasion at least we've spoken in person, not in person, but social media or virtually. That's the word I'm looking for. So thank you. I admire your thoughts and what you share, and like I mentioned to you a few minutes before we started recording, I just there's a lot of things I want to unpack with you because but we'll get to that. Actually, I think you and my last guest are like master's degree collectors. So let's hold on before we get into that. How did you get started in nursing? Because I don't think nursing was the first thing you got into. So how did you get started with your path into nursing? And we'll take it from there.
Yeah, this is like a long story and a short story, I guess. My nan was a nurse. She was trained at UPenn Hospital School of Nursing and graduated in 1948. And that's, I don't know, special to me because actually she died of complications due to Alzheimer's, and one of the last kind of like cogent memories she had was about her work as a nurse. And I think that speaks to like the power and significance of this kind of work. And my mom's a nurse also. She's done primarily community health through school nursing. And so there's always been nurses in my life. And I will also say my dad is a physician. So at one point I really thought my path would probably steer me towards medicine. And then I can remember reading this book when I was like 11 or 12. It's by Catherine Patterson. It's called Jacob Have I Loved. And in the end of the book, the main character goes on to become a midwife. And that's my first memory of knowing what a midwife was. And it's this like fiction, like YA fiction book. And I was like, oh, that's it. That's what I'm supposed to do. Um, so kind of bumped along until I got to undergrad, where I was still kind of chasing down this idea of going into medicine. That's how I kind of ended up at Georgia Tech. But I found that there was these dimensions of my education that were just like not working for me, right? I wanted to ask different kinds of questions than what my initial major in biochemistry was going to allow. And so that's kind of how I found my way to science, technology, and culture, it was like science studies. Um, so I did that, and I really fell in love with philosophy of science and the ways in which the ideas in science and the development of knowledge in science are socially constructed, right? I think that that's a really valuable dimension of the work that we do in science. So it's in particular, like I think this comes to bear on the way I understand the political terrain of our current climate, right? But we can talk about that at some other point. So I eventually, so I did this study in science, technology, and culture, and I also ended up with a focus in women and gender studies in that subfield. And from there, I decided to go on to Sarah Lawrence, where I did my MA in women's history. In part because there was a faculty who had a joint appointment at Georgia Tech and at Sarah Lawrence, and he really kind of encouraged me to think about women's history. And whether that program could be a good fit. And I initially didn't really think so because I didn't think I was that interested in history, but it turns out that's not true at all. And what I'm interested in is like history of ideas and the way that we come to kind of understand things the way we do at a given period in time. And I see continuity across space and time and influence. And it's tempting to want to think about like breaks and ruptures and transformations and radical revolution. But really, like if we look at the way nursing, for example, has kind of evolved, there's things that happened in the 1860s and 1870s that really kind of continue to influence how we understand ourselves today. And so that gets me to, I don't know, like 2006. I was living in New York. I met my spouse, and we we ended up getting married and then moving to Georgia. I got a job after I graduated teaching here in Richmond County, in Augusta, Georgia. And so while I was teaching, I was also like, I loved it. I was teaching special ed, but I also wanted something more and kind of different. And so at that time, I had sort of, at one point, I almost left Sarah Lawrence because I wanted to go to nursing school so I could pursue this midwifery path. I'm glad I stuck with it, and I ended up finishing my MA there. But when we came back to Augusta, they had just started a pre-licensure MSN program at Medical College of Georgia. And so it was like perfect timing for someone like me who had a master's degree already, being able to enter nursing without having to do another bachelor's degree. And so after a year of teaching and having my first kid, I decided I wanted to go to nursing school. From there, I mean, I was sure I was on like this like really linear trajectory at that point. I did not expect to take the detours that I did. But while it was, I ended up falling in love with high acuity nursing. So I spent time working as a staff nurse in a level 1 trauma center emergency department. And then I worked in trauma critical care for quite a while. I did go to midwifery school. I started at Frontier in, I don't know when, 2013. And I graduated at the end of 2015. And shortly thereafter, I started my PhD. And that's sort of in October of 2016, I started as full-time faculty. And I have been teaching ever since.
Now, for you that you took such a trajectory into into academia as part of your role, what was the push towards that? Because academia is one of those areas where a lot of nurses may be hesitant to get into, not because they don't like teaching, but often it doesn't. It affects the pocketbook a little bit, or they don't feel comfortable, or they don't feel qualified for whatever reason. Or what was your push towards that?
I love teaching. I love educating, I love it, and I think it's really, really important. I think that there's ways in which the work that we do as teaching faculty shapes the future of our discipline. And I mean, like, we should really acknowledge how much power there is in that, right? Like, this is a really important thing. But it's also an honor and a privilege, and it's a joy, right? To be able to kind of midwife students from this like non-nursing status to becoming nurses. And so when I'm thinking about like that, I think midwifery really informs the way that I teach and the kind of approaches to pedagogy I take. Mm-hmm. But I also love it. I love seeing lights come on for the first time, and then like students throwing things at you that you never considered before. That is my favorite thing. I love the dialectic of education, right? Where I can frame things for them that they've never thought about before, and then the delight when they do the same thing for me. It's just like, it's awesome.
Yeah, it's actually kind of, you mentioned that there's a couple of courses that I've taught in the past that to a select group of students that tend to challenge challenge the faculty, and they are usually students that have a previous degree. So those tend to be the sort of, I want to say, type A, where they do their homework, they prep, they come to class and ready to ask questions, and that throws some faculty off sometimes. So it's interesting. So it's it's some of the courses that I actually enjoy, because it promotes discussion, and I'm okay with saying, I have no idea what the answer to this, but I like having those discussions that reaches sometimes to an answer, but sometimes it continues on. So yeah. And you have a background in teaching as well. So you mentioned you taught special ed. Actually, my wife taught special ed for a number of years, for 20 some odd years. So do you bring any of those skill sets to your teaching practice? What you did? Because I know my wife, I want to say my wife sometimes uses some of those techniques on me. So
well, I think things like classroom management and like learning how to communicate clearly, like, it sounds so silly and like it wouldn't be hard, but when you're trying to communicate clearly with 5-year-olds with significant developmental delays, like, it really does force the issue of like, are you getting your message across in a way that is apprehendable by the audience? So I think that's really helpful. And I mean, I think that all of our life experiences coalesce to kind of prepare us in different ways. Like, I think, and this is one of the things I like about the pre-licensure master's entry program, right, is that students will think that their background in like entomology won't be useful, or that their background as a, I don't know, business person isn't useful. But really, at the end of the day, it is, and it's in part because it brings this perspective informed by life experience, right? Like, to our discipline in ways that we wouldn't have otherwise. And I think that we benefit from that as a discipline, to have these like the polyvocal perspectives of all these different other fields. So I think that life experience is incredibly valuable. And we don't have a way to quantify that. And of course, like, we could talk a lot about the kind of reductive things that we expect from students. And I think that kind of informs those positions in nursing ed where faculty don't like their power or authority questioned, right? Like, we are accustomed to kind of having a handle on everything.
Right.
But like, even in the clinical setting, we never actually do have a handle on everything, and anything can change at any minute. So why not be open to the possibilities?
I embrace that. I think that's been one of my hardest things to try to get a handle on, since we are teaching online right now with the pandemic and everything. It's been I miss the engagement I can do in a classroom versus online. Online, as the semester has gone by, it feels like less and less people are on video and less people are really engaged. So I see the audience dwindling. It's just I think it's burning them out, and they spend so many hours online. It just becomes. So I miss the classroom interaction. It's got a different energy. It's almost, I feel like a comedian without an audience, right? So
yes,
so like
I hear you.
the feedback's not there. We're like, I need that energy to work off of. So anyway, so thank you for that. Now so first of all, let me say congratulations, because you just recently defended your dissertation, and I have to admit, I hate the word defense. I mean, it should be just a presentation of your dissertation, right? I don't know what you're defending. I mean, the people I always tell people, can we get rid of that terminology? Because you get to a point hoping your committee prepared you so you don't have to defend it anymore, right? So, I mean, if you're defending at that point, it's kind of messed up, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, shouldn't this be? That's really interesting and maybe a different conversation, but I've been thinking a lot about the practices that we engage in as academics, both at the graduate and in the pre-licensure levels.
Yeah.
Why do we do the things we do, and the language that we choose matters?
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah, I agree. I'm lucky. I think the university I got, University of, I'll give them a shout out. University of San Diego. They moved away from the word defense and they call it presentations, because again, your committee has helped you prepare for that moment. At that point, you should just be presenting your work, not defending it from the people that were supposedly helping you. So,
Like,
anyway, so I want to talk about your work, because it sounds fascinating, and I'm sorry I missed your presentation.
no, I can send you the link if you want. I mean, like, if you're interested.
Yeah, actually, I can put it online.
Oh, cool. Okay.
I can put it on the website. So if any of our listeners want to listen to your dissertation, that'll be fantastic. What was the work about, and can you talk a little bit about what got you into that work? Because from the sound of it, it was a little bit part of your previous master's degrees, and it was kind of a combination of the work, right? So what was the topic more specifically about?
Well, so my dissertation focuses on Cassandra Radical Feminist Nurses Network, which was this little radical feminist organization in nursing that was started in 1982, sort of as the Equal Rights Amendment, like the sun set on the Equal Rights Amendment in June of 1982. The American Nurses Convention took place in DC. So there was these two huge events going on: the ANA biannual convention and the end of the Equal Rights Amendment. So there was protests all over DC, and nothing at the ANA convention about this going on. And, the gender composition of nursing being what it was at that moment, which was greater than 90% women,
Right.
I would sort of expect to hear something about it, but really it was it's parallel play, right? Nothing, no crossover. And so Cassandra kind of formed in response to this. Cassandra was founded by Peggy Chin and Charlene Wheeler and other nurses who have gone on to do important and great things. Sort of recognizing that the ANA wasn't taking up these radical feminist kinds of aims, and it was explicitly feminist group, which for nursing was not real common. And I think the other thing I would kind of point out here is that Cassandra Radical Feminist Nurses Network was really primarily kind of like a lesbian separatist type of feminism, mostly, not entirely, but so that's another dimension of Cassandra Radical Feminist Nurses Network that I think was not well accounted for, not well attended to in considerations that were central to the ANA. And so in the formation of Cassandra, we see some parallels with organizations like the National Black Nurses Association and the National Hispanic Nurses Association, where they're both those groups were also kind of formed in response to the predominantly white institution of the ANA not really attending to these community needs in a particularly meaningful way.
Like the underrepresentation of the groups with the larger organizations. Yeah, I agree.
Exactly. And so Cassandra was formed in 1982, and they went on to have several. They would kind of ride along, like, and have side meetings at other bigger meetings. That they did that sometimes, and then they also had some national gatherings themselves. And they published a newsletter 3 times a year from 1982 until the end of 1989. This group was directly connected in with a broader radical feminist community as well. So Denise Connors, for example, was a nurse who wrote frequently for the Cassandra News Journals, who was also cited in Mary Daly's work. Mary Daly was a radical feminist and author of Gynecology, the Meta-Ethics of Radical Feminism. And then other members of Cassandra were also affiliated with collectives like the Furies Collective, which was a lesbian separatist collective in DC in the early 1970s, and it's historically significant in its own right. So what I see in Cassandra is an explicit feminist orientation that was not simply a liberal feminist orientation, but a radical feminist orientation. And I could get into the weeds about talking about the different kinds of feminism if you want. I'll leave that up to you.
Maybe not so much into the weeds, but but I do want to talk about feminism a little bit with you, just because it's often seen as this. It's not seen for what it is, but it's seen as this pro-women, anti-everybody else type of a thing, which it really isn't. But if you want to talk a little bit about this, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I think that there's as many flavors of feminism as there are feminists, and certainly we do have problematic variants of feminism that are very much about I've got mine, so I don't really care about anybody and what they need. I would say a generic definition is sort of political activism and praxis that center an analysis that centers the political, social, economic, and cultural needs of women, and often other folks in gender minorities, although sometimes not, right? And there's also sometimes children included in that kind of purview as well. And you hear me hedging because there are really definitions that would completely contradict that. So the kind of feminism that Cassandra was exercising was radical cultural feminism, which is and the word radical here, I'm going to take a moment and define radical. Radical means kind of getting at the root of things. We have this idea that radical is this super politically charged anything, but at the end of the day, nursing should probably be radical because we should be looking for root causes of problems rather than superficial. So Cassandra identified itself as a radical cultural feminist organization. So they see patriarchy as the a central oppressive force in societies through space and time, and they kind of valorize the feminine arts and femininity. This is in contrast to radical libertarian feminism, which kind of sought balance and androgyny rather than leaning into more feminine identity.
Wow.
And now I've lost my thread of what the question was to begin with.
Just an overall explanation of what feminism, means, which from and I come from a novice perspective, so excuse me if I'm getting this wrong.
You're fine.
But really looking at, and I think a lot of people identify with sort of what you would call the sort of the radical extremes, the extremes part, where I think most people, when they hear feminism, some people get defensive, especially people of my gender, right? So for as a male individual, when you hear feminism, some of the reactions can be, how am I going to fit into this narrative, right? Or is there even a place for me in this narrative? And I think that's some of the extremes that kind of have defaulted me in the past, of saying, well, what is my role? Which was actually, as we're talking about this, was one of my biggest, I want to say, concerns coming into the nursing profession is, will I have opportunities as a male individual or as someone who identifies as, the way I do, coming from a military background, right? So a huge shift in paradigms and how I would be able to progress in the profession, and what would be my role in the profession. And I've had actually people in the past, pretty much blatantly tell me men don't belong in nursing, right? So I know there are variations, and uh, I can see your wheels are turning. So
Well, I think what I would point out there is like that's there are feminist critiques that you can make of that, right? Like, why should we have a profession like nursing be bound by gender roles? Is there anything innate about what we do as nurses that is essentially tied to our gender? And there are feminists that would say absolutely, and then there's others that would say absolutely not. And there's ways in which those kinds of rigid ideals are just as harmful um, for all people, no matter where you identify on the kind of continuum of gender.
yeah, yeah. I've always kind of struggled with that a little bit, because I'm always, I was raised by a single mom, surrounded primarily by women, growing up, and I have two little girls, and so I'm always looking for angles of how can I support anything that would promote equity, right? I think that's kind of my piece, is how can I make sure everybody is on the same like level, right? So from that perspective, I've always tried to find like my role in how I can contribute, but not to, and I'm trying to be careful how I say this. So not to the point where I'm going to hinder my own progress in the profession, right? But how can I find my role in the profession of nursing, where I am supportive of like the movements that I know is going to make the world a better place, but how do I do it without sort of taking a back seat to whatever else is pushing the agenda forward. And those are the things I struggle with. And sometimes I look at the situation, I'm like, you know what, I need to take a back seat on this particular issue, because I should not in any form or fashion be at the head of the line on this one, because there's other individuals more qualified with the experience and the knowledge and the know-how, but I'll be more than happy to support, right? And then there's other issues like for my own stuff, like veteran stuff. I'm like, yes, I do want to be at the head of the line on that one, because that's where my expertise is, right? So that's kind of where my thoughts kind of go. So as you're looking at this, and since you've done like the historical perspective of looking at this, and looking at nursing and where nursing is right now, and the political environment in recent months, or I want to say years, really has pushed nursing to different sides. Right there, we do have nurses that very much supported the current administrations, and then there's other nurses that are on the other extreme, that are very anti-current administration, but for various reasons. And then you mentioned the American Nurses Association, which just kind of took a neutral perspective on things. So from a nursing perspective, from where nursing is right now, what are some of your ideas on where nursing is going, as far as when we look at things like gender roles and how we are dealing with some of the current issues?
Well, that's really interesting, and I think one of the most interesting kind of interstices that has bubbled up recently was during the civil uprising around the murder of George Floyd and others, and at this like time when PPE was running really low, and then you see the United States government and or the National Guards and or police forces, militarized police forces,
Right.
literally mobilizing tanks, right? So we saw tanks running through um, suburban neighborhoods or residential neighborhoods. That's the word I'm looking for. Residential neighborhoods. I think in Minneapolis, at the same roughly the same time, we're seeing images of nurses in New York City wearing literal trash bags.
Yep.
Instead of PPE. And when I think about the confluence of white supremacy and gender, I don't know, cis heteropatriarchy, I can't think of a more cogent example of where we see this prioritization of certain kinds of values, ideals, expectations, and a denigration of other kinds. And so we're really willing to talk about how nurses are heroes and are sacrificial, lambs or whatever. And sorry, we just can't do this, this, and this to protect them. However, we can mount this kind of incredible, extremely resourced response to people exercising their right to protest. And so I think that there's a lot to unpack there, a lot to talk about, a lot to think about. And so I think right now, for me, that feminist critiques also have to include a clear dimension of critical race theory and anti-racist analysis also, right? So in my kind of formulation, those two things can't happen without each other, right? We can't really talk about gender without also talking about race, and also class and ability and other dimensions too. These facets of identity are interlocking, right? And here I'm thinking Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins and their work on feminism and intersectionality in particular, and the matrix of domination. And yet we still find ourselves in a situation as nurses where I think people are kind of tired of hearing about the pandemic, right? That's my I'm tired of hearing about it, I guess. But we're still having nurses who are reusing PPE, right? So
yeah,
we aren't talking about that as a crisis anymore. And yet we still the material reality of reusing an N95 for however long you have to reuse it for, when all other points of my career, it's been a once and one use, one in the room and out, and you throw it away.
Right.
So I think that there's a lot of work that we can do around that. And I think the other thing I would say is that my understanding of what it means to be a nurse and what it means to do nursing as a praxis is inextricably related to my ideas and kind of ethos connected to this anti-racist feminist approach to life. And so when I'm thinking about this, yes, we should be thinking about what's going on at the bedside, but also we really have to embrace the fact that nursing can take place in the world, and it doesn't have to just take place in a hospital setting, right? So back to our very first part of the conversation, we were talking about education. I think sometimes in nursing ed, we get in this stance of thinking about, we need to make nurses work ready for this kind of environment. But maybe we need to be thinking about how to make nurses work ready for the kind of environment Cori Bush is in, right? Where she's right. taking nursing considerations. I think she's taking nursing ideas and trying to put them into action as national policy. And I love her speech about love and what that means, right? To me, that's nursing theory, and that's what it can be. That's what maybe should be.
Right, and I think part of the issue, as you're making my wheels turn now, and I think part of the issue is that we put nursing in this one box of this is what it is, and I think that goes with some of the historical Florence Nightingale type of mentality, which I know some of the people that that are colleagues of mine I've known for years, things like that, very much feel like they need to be in that Florence Nightingale box, right, and not come out of that. And I think that's part of the issue. And one of the reasons I definitely wanted to have you on this show is because you challenge that, right? You challenge that thought process of this, how nurses are put into this sort of drawn as this particular way. And this is what nurses are, and this is what nurses do. So when you do anything outside of that, it seems so strange for people. It's one of the reasons I started this podcast. I'm like, there's so many nurses doing some incredible things. I want to bring that to my undergraduate students and my graduate students, because so many of them just think bedside. And I can't tell you how many times my students have said, oh my God, I never thought about this, or oh my God, this is what I want to get into, or this is what I want to do. But up until that point, the only thing they've been exposed to is bedside nursing. And I think that's where your thought process, and that's where your writings and things like that I've seen really challenges the norm of what nursing should be. I'm doing air quotes since this isn't a video. So we're doing air quotes of how nursing should be. So I love that idea because, like I've mentioned to you before, I've never identified with the Florence Nightingale. I want to say I love her place in history of, brought science and things like that. But nursing has been around for much longer. In different cultures, in different countries. The Florence Nightingale, somebody I saw on social media, somebody had put something about how religion, or Christianity specifically, and Florence Nightingale, and how the concepts of the two were kind of were influenced. And then I was about to chime into that conversation, and I chose not to. But there are so many other countries that don't necessarily follow that model. There's still science-based, evidence-based, but religion doesn't play that big of a role in some of those societies. So what is your getting to the question for you? What do you think about the Florence Nightingale model of nursing, of what we consider sort of traditional nursing, and how does it have a place in today's nursing world, or today's world, period?
That's a really good question. And it's funny because before we signed on, I was on Twitter. One of my colleagues has written an article recently for Nursing Clio, which is a history blog, about Nightingale's colonial legacy. And the first thing I would say is that there has always been, like, nursing has been a thing long before Nightingale came along. Nightingale actually herself went to training school. So that tells us right then and there that she didn't invent it, right?
Right.
Nightingale was a really effective organizer. And I think that she was like kind of indomitable, right? Like I think she was a sort of irresistible force sometimes. But she's also the reason why nursing has largely been kind of like relegated to the hospital setting, right? Like and sort of the order of business for the hospital hierarchy is kind of the way it is. So I think that Nightingale was like the things that she were amazing, right? Like before anyone's ire gets up at me, like I do think that she was important, and we need to understand her role. Yeah. But I also think that she's complicated, and it's not as easy as like sort of seeing her as the angel in the hospital, right? So there's this like the lady with the lamp image has an ideological function for us, right? Like we use that, and sort of this angelic trope of nursing still persists, right?
And I think that's by design, right? I think that's by design. Sort of how Santa Claus wears the red suit, and it was designed by Coca-Cola, right? So I think it's very much not Santa Claus wasn't, but the image of Santa Claus. I think it was a marketing thing. In my head, it's always been a marketing thing of how the lady with the lamp concept has kind of pushed through. Sorry, I interrupted.
Oh, you're fine. And I think that actually what Nightingale really was successful in doing was sanitizing nursing so that it was a palatable profession for the daughters of the middle class and the white daughters of middle class families.
Right.
It's sort of, I mean, we could talk a little bit about Nightingale herself. Like she was only able to go into nursing and be professionally a nurse because she had a like annual allowance that allowed her to do so after she was emancipated by her family.
Right.
And so this like innately privileged perspective, I think, is important that we reckon with. It's also true that is linked up with making nursing into a really white profession, which is also a trend that persists to the present. whether we're talking about the colonial legacy of Nightingale, or even talking about Mary Seacole, who was not
Oh yeah,
allowed to join forces because she was a Creole Jamaican woman.
right.
Um, we see this like active way in which these Victorian ideals of womanhood are being imposed in what this burgeoning profession. We also then shut off everything that happened before 1860, right? Like, because we think of, okay, Nightingale, 1860, boom, nursing came
Boom,
into being. Well,
it's done.
actually, that's not totally true either.
I always like to go back to just again identifying as a male nurse. I always like to go back to like the Knights of Malta. That's just a cool concept of men taking care of people in the battlefield and nursing them back to health. So I always like to uh, uh, go back, but that's not again that goes back to an era where nursing still existed prior to that, and people just not in the way Nightingale, as you mentioned, organized it and kind of placed it in the hospital setting. And but the overall concept has been around since probably the beginning of time of nursing people back to health. And there's individuals in the communities, that did that, right?
Well, and I mean, there are religious legacies, and I think that Nightingale's is tied to Christianity, but there's
Right.
also a long tradition in other faiths of hospital healing, like having centers for healing as part of service to the community. And that that's not delimited just to Christianity or anything.
Right, right. I mean, there's always, I mean, spirituality is one of those components that, however, you identify, with spiritual healing, whether it's related to a sort of an almighty being or anything else, right? I think it definitely plays a role in the individual's healing process. So, yeah, so I think a lot of it has to do with, as you mentioned, of how it was um, colonialized. And I
Well,
think that's where we sometimes bump heads in ideologies.
yeah, and I mean, Nightingale's model was like picked up and exported, so we see it coming to the
Mm,
United States by 1873, and then we see it kind of disseminating around the world as well,
right.
sort of indirectly to places like the Philippines, right? Choi's Empire of Care is a really great um, discussion of the colonial history of nursing between the United States and the Philippines. That if anybody's interested in looking more at that history, she's so good and so interesting. The ways that she's able to capture the transnational flow of people and information and the development of nursing through that time, beginning in the I don't know, I think the end of the 1800s through the 20th century. So there's this way in which it was the model that got picked up and replicated, and that's a colonial endeavor as well, right? Like taking these ideas and transplanting them other places.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. I wish we had more time to talk about this. But I wanted to also get to some of the other work that you're doing right now with sort of, I want to call them side projects, right? You work with Nursology, which actually I didn't know it existed till a couple of years ago. So the concept of you write for a blog with Nursology, and you're also one of the co-founders, founders,
Yeah,
organizers.
that's a little like there's crossover there, but
Yeah.
it's not. They're not the same. I am on
Oh,
the
okay.
the blog management team for the Nursology
Okay.
blog, but I'm also in the Nursology blog put together this theory conference a couple years ago, maybe 2 years ago.
Okay.
I don't know. My sense of space is or time is completely completely distorted.
We're,
Um,
we're
I
all we're all in that boat.
and out of that conference, some of the folks who were so this was conference that they had at Case Western, and I think it was in 2019, was a callback to some historic nursing conferences, nursing theory conferences that took place in the like 1968, 69, and 70, I think. Um, and so they were having this like 50-year kind of commemoration in 2019, and some of the uh, so there was folks who were at those original conferences in the 60s, 70s, and I was not, and there were others of us who were not there, right? So there's this a little bit of a stratification, I think, in terms of age, right? So some of the folks that were there that are still working on like their PhD and things kind of felt like we needed a space where we could talk more about these ideas in nursing, and so we formed what would become the Nursology Theory Collective, although we started out as a nursing theory collective. And so the Nursology Theory Collective, NTC, has done several different things around. We've done posters together around nursing theory, brainstorming ideas for how to bring more nursing theory into teaching spaces, because what I think we're seeing sometimes is that nurses don't, and you sort of suggested this too, we don't have a lot of space time to talk about ideas in nursing. And so there's this kind of failure to recognize that we have that tradition. Like we have this set of ideas in nursing that are central to nursing, that are, organizing principles in nursing. But how do we bring that to the classroom so that we can that kind of persists? Right. And I obviously, like, I like to talk about the history of ideas. I like to talk about the way people think. I like to think about epistemology and ontology. And I think it's good for nurses to do that, all nurses to do that. So that's part of what we do. We've written a few things. We've written some letters, made some like collective statements around the importance of anti-racism and things like that. So yeah, we've also done posts on the Nursology blog, right? So the Nursology Theory Collective is kind of loosely affiliated with the blog, let's say.
Right. Now, from that concept, and you mentioned nursing theory, and it's one of those things that I feel like, and maybe if you can share your experience, are we seeing a movement away from nursing theory from an academic perspective? Because I feel like, from what I'm seeing, there's a movement away from that and more kind of embracement of the medical model. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I do. And I think that we see that there's a couple like sort of avenues in which that's particularly the case sometimes. I think I think we don't always actively think about what the ideas that we're using are, and that sounds kind of meta, I guess, but like we don't talk about nursing process as a theoretical endeavor, right? But drawing from Mary Ellen Purkis here, who's a nurse philosopher in Canada, she kind of characterizes theory as making sense of what's going on around you, right? And we do that all the time in nursing, right? Yeah. And so that's maybe a little bit different from what I think is like nursing theory, at least in the like American tradition, which is a little bit more formal.
Yeah.
But I also think that it's okay for the theory to be a little bit less formal.
Right.
And when we're coming up with these explanations for, like, say, why our patient is tanking, right, that we're doing theorizing and we're testing that theory by doing interventions to see if it fixes the problem or not.
Right.
So yes, I think we're moving away from it, but we still use these ideas. So it's like we're still it's kind of like when you don't interrogate your philosophical assumptions, right? Just because you haven't thought about them doesn't mean they're not there somewhere.
Right. And I think it's the terminology, right? Like, I mean, for me, I think we need to call it out for what it is and not just say it's just this random thing that happens, right? So actually calling it out for what it is and how nursing has its own process. And I think how the thought process, and when I went to school, like, for example, Orem was the sort of the nurse theorist that's, I still, they beat it into my head so much that even at home, when my kids get hurt, I'm like, go take care of it, or, go take care, just sort of like that model of, self-care and, getting them back to, full function type of a thing. But there's been nurse theorists that I've always made sure if I'm writing, I have a nurse theorist sort of embedded in the back of my head when I'm writing and things like that. So I know, from that perspective, it's important for me to have that component. But like I said, I feel like we're not calling it out anymore. And by not calling out like a model or some kind of a thing, we're just it just kind of dissipates as a thought, right?
The Nursology blog does one of the sort of aims of that is to make sure that there's resources for people to recognize that this historical legacy that we have in our intellectual tradition as nurses.
Right.
But yeah, I think you're right. I think we don't talk about it super much. It certainly isn't on the NCLEX or in essentials. And that's important when we're thinking about the structure of nursing education. Important insofar as that's what we've decided is important, right? The essentials and the NCLEX. I don't necessarily always align super closely with those assessments, though.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think you touched on a thing I was just thinking about is like, we don't see it. Like the people that are sort of governing or overseeing nursing education don't call it out. And it's not a requirement at any given point in time. So as a result, I think people aren't spending any energy on it. I think there should be energy spent on it, definitely. So thank you so much. This has been great. I want to give you some time to talk about anything else you want to share with the audience. Any kind of work that you want to do, or you're planning on doing, or.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I have this little dream of making my dissertation into a graphic novel, and so that is something that I'm putting out into the world now for the first time on your podcast.
That's fantastic.
So,
and we know the same person that just put out a graphic novel around.
I know, and that's I think that there's so much power in these other kinds of media, right?
Right.
And like I love to write. No cap, I love writing. It really does like feed my soul, helps me think, is what I enjoy doing. But I also see so much potential in these graphic forms for telling stories that might not get out there otherwise. And the story of Cassandra is a great story. There are some really interesting things that they did and were able to accomplish, and I would love for that to be documented in that way. So that's one, somewhere in the offing outcome I'm hoping for there. And publications for my dissertation as well, of course.
Yeah.
And then I think just continuing my research is my hope. I like you, I don't necessarily find a ton of I don't know. I don't see myself that much in Florence Nightingale. And I think that their representation matters. So it is useful to have other kinds of folks out there as models of what it means to be a nurse and what nurses can look like. And so kind of digging into this sort of queer and radical political history of nursing, which really is out there. That's sort of what I envision the program of research that I'll be embarking on next.
That's fantastic. And as you're mentioning, the graphic novel, there's just so many ways that I think, again, it goes back to how we've constructed nursing, right? Where everything turns into a peer-reviewed paper as a way for us to disseminate information. And there's so many other avenues, like the graphic novels. I'm working on an art project around, things like PPE and how, healthcare workers during the Black Lives Matters movements have interacted, and a lot of other issues. But I think there's so many other creative ways for us to get information out as nurses, as scientists, as nursologists. So there's so many different avenues that we can do this. I think we just need to, from a professional perspective, we really need to look at how we have defined what we can and can't do, right?
And this goes back to the like, who are we and what do we mean to the world? I think that right. In particular, visual representations have a power to kind of shake that up sometimes in ways that if you're already interested in like radical feminism, or if you're already interested in nursing, you might pick up a book about it. But if you're not,
but I mean that's been one of my arguments is like that we need to be reaching an audience outside of just nursing, right? And if we're just publishing in nursing peer-reviewed journals, the general public is not seeing the work that we're doing as scientists, right, or as activists, or however you want to, or policymakers and things like that. So I think we need to really take a look at our place in the world and how and who we're engaging, right? And how we're engaging.
And that's why I think the work that Lauren Underwood is doing is so important. The work
Yes,
that Cori
yes.
Bush is doing is so important. That's why the kind of community engaged activism that Monica McLemore does is so important. That's
Oh,
why
yeah, yeah,
MK's work is so special, right?
right.
Is that we're getting people to think about the work that we do in transformative kinds of ways rather than like handmaiden of the whatever kind of ways, right? Like that's really never who nursing has been. And even
Right.
Florence Nightingale wasn't such a handmaiden. If people learned a little
No.
more about her, she was kind of a force of nature, for better or worse.
Yeah, I mean, she definitely had. There's definitely issues with her, but she definitely was not the quiet, submissive
She really
housewife
wasn't.
of the time, right? So she really
Right.
did step out of that box, and I think that's one thing I can always say. I appreciate about her and the Mary Seacles of the world, where they stepped out of the box of what was expected of them. Um, um, like I said, they all had their issues and problems, and we need to address those appropriately. But I think, from the perspective, if anything that I can relate to is being not following the norm of what was expected. I think that's something we took sort of these radical nurses and we put them in a box and said, everybody else be like them. And I think that doesn't always fit. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate you being on this show. Loved our conversation. Hopefully, next time I call you and say, can we talk? It won't be just for the podcast. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you. We have been listening to and speaking with Dr. Jess Dillard-Wright. Congratulations again on your dissertation presentation. And successful completion of that. So thank you so much. And I want to wish everybody a fantastic rest of your week. And we'll be talking to you soon. Have a great one. You've been listening to the RN Mentor with your host, Ali Tayeb. Please don't forget to visit www.alirtayeb.com. That's www.alirtayeb.com for podcast notes and resources. And don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, I wish you fair winds and following seas.